The sun blazed down over the sprawling parade ground, baking the cracked concrete under its relentless heat. The air shimmered slightly in the distance, and the faint smell of dust and sweat lingered as hundreds of boots stood planted in perfect rows. The rhythmic clink of metals against uniforms was the only sound that broke the stillness, as 282 soldiers stood in precise formation, their spines straight, their eyes forward. Discipline was etched into every motion, but beneath the rigid posture, there was an undercurrent of tension, a collective sense that something was about to happen. At the far end of the formation, a lone figure stepped into view. Colonel Sergei's boots struck the ground in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each step echoing with authority. His pressed uniform was immaculate, the gold trim on his epaulettes glinting in the harsh light. His jaw was set, lips thin, and his eyes were cold, the kind of cold that made men twice his size falter under his gaze. Soldiers had long since learned that his temper could flare without warning, and his punishments, whether verbal or otherwise, were swift and merciless. The sound of his march carried across the open space, and conversations that had been whispered among the ranks before his arrival vanished instantly. Sergei's shadow stretched ahead of him as he walked down the line, inspecting each soldier with the precision of a man who noticed everything, from a speck of dust on a boot to the smallest twitch of an eye. His expression gave nothing away, but those who had served under him knew that the longer his silence lasted, the sharper his eventual words would cut. Near the center of the formation stood Captain Elena. Her posture was as rigid as any soldier's, but there was an unmistakable air of calm around her. The brim of her cap cast a slight shadow over her eyes, though it couldn't hide the quiet confidence in her gaze. Unlike some, she didn't flinch as the colonel's steps drew nearer. She had faced him before, in meetings, in training sessions, and once during a public disagreement over a tactical decision. He had never forgiven her for challenging him, and she had never regretted it. Sergei's gaze slid past several soldiers before locking onto her. His pace slowed almost imperceptibly, his boots landing with heavier emphasis now, as if each step was a statement in itself. The soldiers on either side of Elena seemed to stiffen further, instinctively bracing themselves as if they could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. The colonel's eyes swept over her uniform, her stance, and finally her face. For the briefest moment, the edges of his mouth curled downward, a silent acknowledgement of the tension between them. The air felt thicker, hotter. Even the faint breeze that had been drifting lazily across the ground seemed to die as he stopped a single step away from her. His presence was imposing up close, not just from his rank but from the sheer intensity of his demeanor. The rest of the formation held their breath, their peripheral vision fixed on the confrontation they knew was inevitable. Somewhere, a bead of sweat rolled down the side of a soldier's face, but he didn't dare wipe it away. Colonel Sergei didn't speak yet. He simply stood there, towering over Elena, his gaze like a blade pressing against her composure. She didn't break eye contact, didn't blink. Around them, 282 soldiers stood frozen in the scorching sun, waiting for the first spark to ignite whatever fire was about to burn across the parade ground. The colonel's stillness broke with a sudden step forward, his boots clicking sharply against the concrete as he loomed over Elena. His voice rang out, loud enough to carry across the entire parade ground, slicing through the oppressive silence. "Captain Elena," he barked, each syllable heavy with accusation, "do you think I have forgotten your blatant insubordination during last month's exercise?" His tone was less a question and more an opening statement in a public trial. A faint murmur rippled through the ranks. Every soldier there remembered the operation he referred to. It had been a tense field exercise in the forest where Elena had made a call that contradicted his direct order, and, ironically, saved her unit from an ambush. The official report had been smoothed over, but the colonel had never truly accepted being challenged in front of subordinates. Elena kept her chin high, eyes locked on his without a flicker of fear. "With respect, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, "my decision was in the best interest of the mission and the men under my command." There was no tremor, no apology hidden between the words. Her calm response seemed to strike a nerve. Sergei's face tightened, his jaw muscles shifting under the skin. "Best interest," he repeated, his voice dripping with scorn. "You disobeyed a direct order. You embarrassed your commanding officer in front of the unit. And now you dare stand here and justify it." He took another step forward, the distance between them shrinking until the edge of his shadow merged with hers. The soldiers' eyes flicked between the two, but no one dared to move. The tension was tangible, like a storm about to break. Some of the younger recruits swallowed hard, their hands tightening around their rifles. They knew the colonel's temper, they had seen him dress men down until they wanted to vanish into the ground. But this was different. This was personal. Alina's voice remained measured. "I acted to protect lives, sir. If that displeases you, I accept your reprimand. But I will not apologize for keeping my soldiers alive." She didn't raise her tone, yet the words carried with a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with the colonel's bluster. The murmurs in the ranks grew a fraction louder before being smothered under the weight of Sergei's glare. He was not a man accustomed to being challenged, and certainly not in front of nearly 300 troops. His chest rose and fell with quickened breaths, the flush of anger creeping up his neck. "You speak as though you're the one in command here," he said, his voice dropping lower but becoming even more dangerous. "Let me remind you, Captain, your place is to follow orders, not rewrite them." He took yet another deliberate step, now so close that Elena could feel the faint heat radiating from him. From somewhere deep within the formation, a boot shifted against the concrete, a nervous tell that someone was bracing for the inevitable. The colonel's hands twitched at his sides, curling slightly, as if suppressing the urge to act. He stared at her with a look that was half rage, half challenge, as though daring her to say one more word. Elena didn't waver. Her gaze stayed locked on his, steady as steel. Around them, the soldiers held their breath, their uniforms sticking to their backs in the sweltering heat. The unspoken understanding was clear. The next moment would decide whether this confrontation stayed verbal or exploded into something far more dangerous. The space between them seemed to shrink into nothing, the tension coiling tighter with each passing second. Colonel Sergei's eyes burned into Alina's, his breath heavy and sharp. Then, in one sudden motion, his right arm shot upward, his hand curling into a fist. The movement was so abrupt that a few soldiers in the ranks flinched instinctively, the metallic clink of gear breaking the brittle silence. It was an act that defied every rule of military conduct, a commanding officer striking a subordinate in full view of the unit. But in that moment, Sergei didn't seem to care. His pride had been pushed too far, and his anger now sought a target it could crush. The 282 soldiers who had stood like statues only moments before now felt a jolt of disbelief ripple through them. No one could look away. Time seemed to slow for Elena. Her peripheral vision caught the rigid lines of uniforms, the stillness of rifles gripped tightly, the white eyes of the men and women who had served alongside her. She saw the colonel's fist cutting through the hot air toward her face, his intention as clear as the sun above them. Her mind was sharp and calm, the product of years of training and more than a few close calls in the field. She could have stepped back. She could have simply taken the blow and filed a formal complaint later, keeping her career intact and letting the system decide his fate. But there was something in the colonel's eyes, that cruel satisfaction at the thought of humiliating her in front of the entire regiment, that made retreat impossible. Across the formation, a young private's lips parted in shock, his knuckles whitening around his weapon. Another soldier's eyes darted toward the nearest superior officer, silently begging for someone to intervene, but no one moved. The chain of command was a powerful thing, and Sergei was at the very top of it here. The colonel's shadow fell over Alina's face just as the fist came within striking range. She registered the raw aggression in his movement, the overextension in his shoulder, the reckless speed that betrayed his lack of control. Every detail etched itself into her focus. Years of combat drills, of hand-to-hand sparring, of reacting under pressure, all condensed into a single heartbeat. The world around her faded, the rows of soldiers, the suffocating heat, the glint of sunlight off brass buttons, until there was only the incoming strike and her body's instinctive readiness to respond. She could feel her muscles coil, her weight shifting ever so slightly on her feet, her right hand preparing to intercept. Sergei's jaw was tight, his teeth clenched as if already savoring the impact. He wasn't just striking her, he was delivering a public statement meant to crush her authority and cement his own. But what he didn't realize was that he had already crossed a line from which there was no return. Somewhere behind Elena, a soldier exhaled sharply, breaking the silence just enough to mark the moment. The colonel's fist was now less than a foot from her face. Every soldier watching knew they were seconds away from witnessing something that would be spoken about in hushed tones for years to come. Whether it would end in humiliation or defiance, that was about to be decided. The instant before the colonel's fist could land, Elena moved. Her reaction was neither panicked nor frantic, it was precise, the product of discipline forged through countless hours of combat training. She stepped half a pace to the side, just enough to let the momentum of his swing carry him slightly off balance. Her right hand shot up, gripping his wrist in a firm, almost effortless motion. Gasps rippled through the formation, but Elena wasn't finished. She pivoted on the ball of her foot, twisting her body in perfect coordination with the movement of her arms. In one fluid motion, she redirected the colonel's own force against him, yanking his arm downward and across her frame. The sharp torque sent a shockwave through his shoulder. Before he could recover, her left hand locked onto his forearm just below the elbow. The technique was simple in principle but devastating when executed correctly, a joint lock with a brutal follow-through. Elena applied pressure with exact precision, her movements crisp and controlled. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. The colonel's body jerked involuntarily as the strain on his arm intensified, the tendons and muscles protesting violently. Then came the sound, a sickening, unmistakable crack that cut through the parade ground like a rifle shot. A collective shudder passed through the rows of soldiers. Some flinched, others widened their eyes, but none dared speak. The colonel's face twisted in raw agony, his mouth opening in a short, sharp cry before his knees buckled. He dropped to the ground, clutching his now broken arm, his once commanding posture reduced to a crumpled heap at her feet. Elena released her grip the moment the damage was done, stepping back with the same composure she had before the attack began. Her breathing was steady, her gaze unwavering. She didn't gloat, didn't speak, she simply stood tall, her shadow now stretching over him as his had over her moments earlier. The balance of power had shifted in an instant, and every single soldier on that field felt it. The colonel's cap tilted on his head as he hunched over, beads of sweat mingling with the dust on his face. His pride had taken a blow even more devastating than his arm, and it showed in the desperate, almost feral look in his eyes. But with the pain radiating up his shoulder and into his chest, even his rage couldn't pull him back to his feet. From somewhere in the ranks, a soldier's jaw tightened as if suppressing the urge to smile. Others kept their expressions locked in professional neutrality, though the tension in the air now had a different weight, less fear, more awe. This was not an act of rebellion for its own sake, it was a precise and calculated defense against an abuse of power. And it had been executed flawlessly. Elena's stance was unshaken. The sun beat down on her shoulders, highlighting the crisp lines of her uniform, the dust on her boots, the unwavering strength in her frame. She didn't need to explain herself, the entire regiment had just witnessed everything they needed to know. The colonel groaned low, his breath ragged, the sound barely audible over the pounding silence that had settled over the parade ground. The echo of that crack still seemed to hang in the hot air, as if the ground itself remembered what had just happened. The parade ground had fallen into an unnatural stillness, the kind that made every small sound seem amplified. The colonel remained on his knees, his once imposing figure now hunched and diminished, his right arm cradled awkwardly against his chest. His breaths came short and uneven, each one edged with pain. Dust clung to the sweat on his face, streaking his skin in uneven lines. Elena stood a step away from him, her posture straight, her eyes calm and unreadable. She made no move to help him, nor did she take a step forward to press her advantage. Her hands rested at her sides, fingers loose, the picture of discipline. She had not acted out of malice, every soldier watching could see that. Her actions had been measured, deliberate, and in response to an unprovoked attack. That fact, hanging heavy in the air, made her presence feel even more commanding. The 282 soldiers in formation kept their eyes locked forward, but not a single one could ignore what they had just witnessed. Even without turning their heads, they could feel the shift in the air, as though the parade ground itself had tilted in Elena's favor. Some hearts pounded faster, not from fear, but from the shock of seeing the chain of command fracture in real time. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of a young private's face, but he didn't dare move to wipe it. In the second row, a sergeant's lips pressed into a thin line, not in disapproval, but in the effort of keeping his expression neutral. The rules of discipline were ironclad here, yet they all knew what they had seen was not a breach of those rules, it was a defense, executed with perfect precision. The colonel finally tried to stand, but the pain in his arm made the attempt pitiful. His knees wobbled, his face twisted into a grimace, and for the first time in the memory of those present, he looked small. The sound of his boots scuffing against the concrete was almost drowned out by the collective silence of nearly 300 soldiers. No one stepped forward to help him, not out of cruelty, but because every soldier knew that in this moment, no one dared insert themselves between the two officers. Alina's gaze swept across the formation. She didn't speak, didn't command, and yet her silence said more than words could. It was the silence of control, of someone who had just proven, without needing rank or bluster, that she could hold her ground against anyone. Her uniform was immaculate despite the brief clash, her breathing steady as though the entire incident had been nothing more than a routine drill. The colonel finally managed to push himself upright, though he leaned slightly to his left to avoid jarring the broken arm. He glared at her, his expression a tangled mix of fury, humiliation, and disbelief. But there was something else there too, the faint flicker of realization that whatever power he thought he held over her had just been shattered in front of every witness. The heat of the sun bore down, turning the air into a heavy blanket that pressed against skin and uniform alike. Still, no one moved, no one spoke. The moment had frozen, captured in the unblinking eyes of 282 soldiers. In years to come, they would remember exactly where they had stood, exactly how the sunlight fell, and exactly how the sound of that breaking bone had echoed. Elena didn't allow herself even the smallest gesture of triumph. She simply stood her ground, the embodiment of discipline under pressure. And in the stillness, one truth settled over the parade ground like dust: the hierarchy had changed, and everyone there had just witnessed the moment it happened.